Good morning. Welcome to Chapter 7, Topic D, Integrate Systems and Data with Third Parties. A new section in this book from the last book. So, virtual guarantee, there's a little bit of testable information in here. We're going to take a look first off at our business partners. And that would be our customers and our suppliers and those folks, resellers, agents, vendors, anybody that has any sort of business relationship with us. And all these different parties, these different third parties, have different relationships, so the handling is a little bit different. You might have a relationship based on contractual terms. You might have a relationship based on a historical processes of operating on a handshake, maybe an informal relationship. And one of the things about business partners is the fact that some level of information sharing takes place between them. And there's a new couple of terms that are popular, and those terms are onboarding and offboarding. And that has to do with sort of the new paradigm having to do with hiring and firing in terms of how do I deal with devices that they use, that they bring with them to the table, and the data that's stored on those devices. So when you hire someone, or when you join a relationship with someone, you have to determine this onboarding relationship, how their existing tools fit into your program, what they're allowed to use in your facility, those kind of things. And the offboarding process used to be, you would simply sever a relationship. You and the former employee / business partner would go their separate ways. But now you've got to consider the devices that they use, that they have in their possession when they terminate the relationship, and how you reclaim the data, how you ensure that that they're not holding on to some residual data that they have no further legal right to. So those are a couple of new terms. I've seen those around in non-CompTIA materials. So our good folks at CompTIA decided to get on board with some of the new terminology. So you'll see onboarding and offboarding. There's very short blurb at the very top of this topic that mentions it briefly. Social media networks and applications. Okay, well, social media is a fact of life. Everybody's using it to some degree. Organization, even the State Department, we use Facebook and Twitter to keep in touch with each other and disseminate information. But the deal is, it's not as tightly controlled as maybe some other communications methods may have been in the past. And of course, that information, in fact, Twitter is widely known throughout the world now as maybe the first place where you're going to get information on local issues, weather events and conflicts and whatever else. I mean, the Twitter sphere will light up long before your traditional news organizations maybe get their hands on the story. So it's a relevant social force. So that fact alone is important from the perspective of sensitive information. So once some piece of sensitive information hits the social media world, it can become global in seconds. So again, the concerns are there about what you do with your data, or what you do with your business partner's data. Now, with social media and the different forms of social media, I mean, there's the predominant platforms, the Twitters and Facebooks, but there's others, and there's always someone waiting to take advantage of social media for their own purposes. Get out in front of these new trends where the users might be on board but aren't yet familiar with all the perils associated with it. So there's always somebody that's going to be willing to take advantage of you. So social engineering, one of our big attack vectors, becomes a big problem. We kind of described that in a previous module. So the administrative folks, they're the ones out there kind of on the leading edge of providing training and making sure the users are aware of security issues. So these guys, whether they, you hear plenty of people saying, "No, I don't even have a Facebook page. I don't use Facebook. My wife and kids use Facebook." Whatever. That's nice, but that doesn't relieve you the responsibility for understanding how it works and being aware of the inherent risks. Proper tools, of course. I assume they're talking about antivirus scanning type tools, network vulnerability scanning type tools, and again, in every organization, every business relationship has its own unique set of concerns. You yourself have your own unique set of concerns regarding the information that's available in your environment. So again, on a daily basis, we're interacting with pretty much the entire world when it comes to some of these social media interactions. So you need to get out in front of that. To make these formal business relationships, you have some legal terms you need to be familiar with. An SLA, a service level agreement, it's a contract between you and a third-party provider. That third-party provider might be a utility, might be an internet service provider. And that document lays out, specifies the requirements they're required to fulfill in your business relationship in terms of the amount of uptime maybe, or if they don't achieve the uptime that they promise, there's a maybe financial penalty associated with that. So these SLAs are there to give you some level of control over systems that you don't own. All your systems that you own, your computer systems, your information systems, internally, in-house, the possibility exists that you completely, own that space. You've got that completely working properly. Got the right people on it. Everything works. Just kind of hums along. But again, you don't own the ISPs and the electric service utilities and so on. So the only way to get them to participate in your view is to contractually obligate them. And a thing about an SLA will have a standards section in the agreement that specifies what their required level of service is, and gives you a way to monitor that they are indeed compliant with what they're agreeing to. So you've got some visibility into their systems, into their assets from either your own tools or tools provided by them, so you can verify that they are indeed meeting their contractual obligations. A business partner agreement, BPA, defines the relationship between business entities and who's responsible for what. And from our perspective, the security perspective, we're concerned with, the information that we're going to share with each other as a part of this relationship, and kind of lay that out. So your staff understands, what information their people are allowed to access, and vice versa. An MOU, a memorandum of understanding, that's not necessarily a legally binding document, but it's a less formal business relationship document, if you will. Just sort of kind of outlines in general terms how the two business entities interact with each other, but it's not a sort of a legally binding contract. But if it's and generally the only way you can kind of get away with something like that is if there's no, essentially, money changing hands. And it's kind of, think of it kind of as a gentleman's agreement, a handshake. It's I'm sure it's written down, but it's more or less an informal agreement. And then finally, an interconnection security agreement, an ISA. This is geared towards the information systems of partnered entities. Ensure the use of interorganizational technology meets certain security standards. So these are generally, legally binding. They do involve how sensitive information is treated between the two entities. And of course, in addition to one of these interconnection security agreements, a memo of understanding is very likely a part of this relationship. So again, you're going to be on the hook to recognize what these terms generally stand for. So, just a very short explanation of the book. Definitely read through that. Risk awareness. Okay. One of the prime movers in any kind of business relationship is your ability to manage risk. And we'll talk about that in the next chapter. But this is sort of an ongoing, continuous operation issue. You need to kind of keep on top of your day-to-day operations, and your risk potentially changes on a daily basis. Your threats, threats can come and go, and vulnerabilities, new vulnerabilities can emerge, and older vulnerabilities can become less vulnerable, and it's a dynamic landscape. So you need to stay tuned to what's going on between you and your partners, and assess any potential risk issues associated with that. Employees within their own departments need to be on the lookout for risk-based conditions that affect what they do. And that's part of the ongoing security and training, security training and awareness programs. And again, risk management is pretty much an all-hands operation. Everybody needs to have some knowledge and understanding of what to do in the event of risk, your risk profile changing, increased threat, possibility, or new vulnerabilities that maybe you've discovered. So risk awareness, it's you're not asking your users and potentially even your business partners to make risk management decisions, but your decisions are going to be better if your people basically understand kind of what risk is, and what your organizational policy on various things is in terms of risk management. So again, provide them with the tools and the understanding on how to keep a handle on your risk profile. Again, no easy way to do that, I suspect, but that's why you get paid the big bucks. Data sharing and backups. Let's say, just for the sake of argument, I'm Boeing and you're Lockheed, and we won a government contract, and as part of that contract, we're developing a military avionics suite, for military aircraft, and your engineers need some level of access to certain amounts of my data, and my engineers need access to a specific server at your organization. So again, just because we're in a business relationship doesn't mean you have carte blanche access to everything I have. That's not realistic, and it's not secure, and it's bad. So recognize that just because they're a business partner, you don't have to overshare. You don't have to share everything with these guys. It's very important to determine as your relationship goes forward, data is going to be generated as an outgrowth of this relationship, and there need to be very clear guidelines on who is the owner of said data, who owns the data, who has access to the data. So don't let that be unclear. And of course, in order to enforce that, you've got access control mechanisms that that allow you to extend access to someone maybe in a different Active Directory forest. That you learn those sort of things in your Microsoft System Admin type classes. But there are techniques to allow you to extend the reach of your permissions infrastructure to users outside of your own organization. So those mechanisms are in place, and it's it's a probably a good idea to learn how to use those. Of course, the employees, again, user awareness and training, they need to be aware of the nature of these relationships and just what these this particular business partner does and does not have access to. Potential legal issues, legal issues of sharing data, certain types of data at a certain classification. You might, in my previous example, there might be national defense consequences if that information is leaked to the public. So there's additional special handling required potentially of data at that particular clearance level maybe. So again, that's an important consideration. And data, you're only as good as your last backup. So if you're sharing data, well, probably the owner of said data is probably on the hook to ensure that it's adequately backed up. Don't be pointing fingers at each other saying, well, I thought you were doing it. Well, I thought you were doing it, kind of a thing. Don't find yourself in that position. So again, data backup is obviously very important. So that needs to be laid down right from the beginning of the relationship. Just some general guidelines, things to think about when of necessity you're dealing with folks outside of your own organization. The whole onboarding and offboarding procedure. Again, business dynamics. There's different things in play, different technologies, different requirements for data access. So develop these procedures for bringing people into this relationship, and then procedures for handling the termination of the relationship. So there's that term again, onboarding and offboarding. Bringing people on board. What do you need to do to bring them on board safely and securely? And then once it's time to sever the relationship and offboard them, what sort of things do you need to do before you no longer have pretty much access to them? Draft interoperability agreements appropriate for your situation. You're dealing with third parties that may very well be using different systems than you, to some degree more or less incompatible. So in order to access data generated by a particular system, there needs to be a way determined to convert that data to be compatible with their system. Are you going to convert it using XML, kind of the standard for text-based data transfers? Are you using some other mechanism to ensure that my systems are quote unquote compatible with your systems in terms of sharing data? And if you're going to go to the trouble of actually creating these agreements, you should probably follow those policies that the agreements state. Review them periodically, or review them initially to ensure that they're compliant with local, state, federal, international laws, those kind of things. Run it by the legal department, and chances are they're already looking at it and going to come brief you on the consequences potentially. Use social media responsibly. Don't you now are kind of the custodian of some information that is relevant to some other business entity. So how you handle information that has that reaches outside your own company from a social media perspective is important, because improper disclosure of that business information potentially might cause harm to that other business entity, and that can lead to legal complications. So be aware of the perils and pitfalls of social media. Training users, good idea. They need to be aware of what to do and what not to do vis-a-vis Twitter and Facebook and those kind of things. Risk awareness, basically indoctrinate, train your employees on the concept of risky behaviors and risk factors and threats and vulnerabilities to give them a basic idea of what to be on the lookout for, and potential conditions that could lead to a compromise of data. Those conditions should be you should train the users to identify potential conditions that could make your system somewhat less secure. Define ownership of data. So in the end, there's no question as to who should have done what with the data. There's no finger pointing, he said, she said kind of stuff. Control data sharing. In other words, determine what data actually is shareable and at what level. And again, data backups. If your data is being backed up by a third party, maybe you're using the cloud, cloud services of some partner of yours. There need to be clear guidelines on how often and how it's secured and those sorts of things. So again, there's it's a big connected world out there, and we enter into agreements with third-party organizations all the time. So I guess the Security Plus, the CompTIA folks have sort of decided to follow industry trends and sort of not finalize, but sort of institutionalize some of these kind of relationship issues and hold you accountable for it on the test. So again, exercise common sense in these things, and ensure that you've got proper legal standing and backup of your own organization. And that takes us to the end of Chapter 7. Next up on the hit parade is Chapter 8. Give me a moment to queue up the slides. So Clay's saying, hey, we had a memorandum of understanding with somebody, and that had to apparently evolve from an informal agreement to something more legally binding because one of the two parties took advantage of the other party somehow, and basically the legal team said, hey, listen, we need to put some teeth into this thing. Yeah, because who can you trust, right? I mean, it's you enter into business relationships ideally with the business entities that you want to do business with, but sometimes you just may be forced to enter into relationships that you would not normally enter into because maybe you've got a sole source supplier and maybe their business practices are a little shakier than yours, so what started off as a simple handshake maybe devolved into something else, and I don't have any specific insight into that issue, but at least now you know what a memorandum of understanding is. There you go. All right, and here we are, Chapter 8, Risk Management. A lot of good stuff in here. The concept of risk analysis. What are the components that go into risk analysis? What do we mean by risk analysis? I'll reveal that. We've got threat analysis and we've got vulnerability analysis. Risk is the likelihood, the percentage of likelihood that a particular threat is going to exploit a particular vulnerability. And you've got many of these threat vulnerability combinations that you have to evaluate in your organization. So risk analysis, it's a complex process involving a lot of things. But once you've sort of determined, done your threat analysis, done your vulnerability analysis, then you've got the tools. You've got actual tools out there that you can use to conduct your vulnerability scans to determine whether or not a system has any provides any exposure. And of course, the vulnerability scanning, that's historically on this test, there are a lot of questions about vulnerability scanning, and they like it. So, like I was saying before, you might have 10 test questions where one of the answer choices is scan for vulnerabilities or vulnerability scanning. 9 times out of 10, that'll be the right answer. You almost don't even need to read the question. I highly suggest you read the question, but, kind of in the back of your mind, be thinking to yourself, hey, was Mark right about this or not? Let's find out. And of course, once you analyze risk, then after each of these kind of threat vulnerability assessments, you've got a risk analysis for that particular environment. What can I do about it? Can I mitigate the risk? Can I lessen the risk? Can I manage the risk? So let's proceed from there. Okay, notice, if you will, we've got a cycle going on. There's a risk management process that follows certain steps. Identify the risks. I mean, how can you assess risks if you don't know what they are? If you're not really tuned into what's going on. So you identify the risks, identify them, and determine to what degree they can affect you. Analyze the risks on your system. Some risks are more acceptable than others. Some systems are more important from a security perspective than other systems. So even if there's a high likelihood of that system being compromised, that may not be as big a deal as some other system that doesn't have really as high a likelihood, but if it does happen, it's much more, there's much more of a business impact to it. So once you've identified the risks, well, what are you going to do about it? You have to determine in advance, through policies and such, how you're going to respond to a particular, risk kind of case study there. And then, okay, let's go further and determine what can I do to limit my risk. What mitigation strategies can I use? So again, the overriding concern or overriding concept being, it's a risk management is identifying what are my threats, what are my vulnerabilities, and a risk is a specific threat exploiting a specific vulnerability, and what's the likelihood of that happening. And once you've determined that, then you also determine, well, and what's the bottom line impact to my organization if that happens. So it's, again, this is why you get the big bucks to kind of make these kind of determinations and kind of guide your company forward in this regard. So we've got the different assessments. I mean, the risk assessment itself, it's, there's this risk management process that involves these steps, but ultimately the threat assessment is where for each you've got information systems, you've got data, you've got assets. Well, there will be different risks to different assets. I mean, for your your proprietary company data, there might be a high likelihood that the Russian government or the Chinese government is going to attempt to hack your system to gain this information. For other systems, there may not be that level of interest, but other systems may be of interest to the local criminal element, much more so than some international governmental entity, kind of a deal. So you've got different your information, your data is of different levels of interest to different people. There's not just one overriding threat to everything. Every individual data system, every individual information system has its own specific set of threats, and that's part of the assessment. Determine who is interested, who would benefit from gaining access to the data on this particular system, and what's the likelihood of that happening? Well, how can that possibly happen? That's where the vulnerability assessment comes in. So I'm looking for weaknesses in my system. And we've talked already in some depth about things like, port scans, things of that effect, to identify, weaknesses that can be exploited by the bad guys. We talked about secure development processes for our applications to kind of minimize the possibility of having my application be flawed to the point where it can be exploited by the bad guys, kind of thing. So you have your threat assessments. Again, these threat assessments are pretty much on a per asset basis. Your different assets, your different information systems or information within those systems is going to be of interest to different different parties. So to sort of sum up, a threat is who would benefit from exploiting this asset. The threat can be criminals, foreign governments. Well, I mean, it can be natural threats. I mean, your facility might be in a physical location that is subject to flooding or whatever. So the point is, you've got threats against your data, threats against your information. Now, the other thing you look at then are the vulnerabilities. I've got my information. What vulnerabilities exist that might be used by some threat? I've already determined that this information system would be of interest to foreign governments. So what vulnerabilities exist in this information system that might be exploited by those threats? So there's two completely separate things there. The threats are those entities that would choose to do you harm, by accessing your proprietary company data. And the vulnerabilities are, okay, what are the attack vectors? How can I get to my data? And then once you've kind of determined those things, so that you've got your threats, then you've got your vulnerabilities that can be accessed by those threats. And overall risk assessment is, what's the likelihood of this threat exploiting this vulnerability? And so you're going to have a whole bunch of individual, risk assessments on, all of these individual components. So basically, threat analysis and vulnerability analysis, the two of those things are factored in to determine, okay, what's the risk? What is the percentage of likelihood that threat is going to access my system using that vulnerability? So again, the concept being the basic risk analysis process is threat, meet vulnerability. Vulnerability, threat. You kids talk, and we'll get back together later. What's the likelihood of that threat utilizing this vulnerability to get to my data? And that's where the fun starts. That makes sense to you? Did that explanation kind of help you out at all? Still on the fence on that one? All right, just kind of put that in the back of your mind. It should become more clear versus less clear as we go into this. So let's kind of evaluate our different types of risk. Where does risk come from? Well, you've got natural factors. I mean, there's risk of damage / compromise from fires, floods, earthquakes, tsunamis, typhoons, those kind of things. Fires. If your facility is located in a floodplain, then if a flood happens and fills the first 3 floors of your building with water, and your data center is in the basement, that's bad. That's a risk. What's the likelihood that flood's actually going to happen and fill up my building with water? If that's based on historical records, this physical location hasn't flooded in over 200 years. So the likelihood of that might be really low. But on the other hand, even though the likelihood of that might be low, if it happens, the amount of damage is the impact to my business is going to be high. So I might have to take some countermeasures, take some actions to ensure that that doesn't affect me, or to ensure that I'm able to accept that. So the point is, you've got different types of risks: natural disasters, man-made disasters. Those are generally pretty easy to figure out there. There's intentional things. I mean, employees steal stuff, and insurance fraudsters will set buildings on fire, those kind of things. And then probably the larger component of man-made disasters is your people not following procedures, being negligent, or maybe even not being negligent, but not having the knowledge or the training to understand what they're supposed to do to secure some system or other. So either way, it doesn't matter if the carbon-based life form did it on purpose, or if they didn't do it on purpose. If your building burns down, it's the building is still burned down. It doesn't really matter how the building burned down. Then you've got system-related risk factors as well. Now, they've sort of broken out man-made from system things. You've got mobile devices. They carry certain levels of risk due to their portability and their how easy it is to maybe steal them. Virtualization, again, that's a potential risk if we're using virtualization technologies more and more, and we need to understand that those virtualization elements need to be protected independently of everything else. Access to our routers, our switches, our network infrastructure, if those things are improperly secured or improperly configured. Email systems, email vulnerabilities. What are we letting through? What are we not letting through? What's the impact of spam on our systems? And account management issues are kind of a big deal. I mean, the administrators, the systems admins, you guys, create the user accounts, assign permissions to the user accounts. Well, again, the user account is that entry point into your system, your information system. So if the user account process is flawed, then kind of everything else is compromised as a result. So now I know you can argue that, well, all of these devices, if we're using BlackBerries, and there's a BlackBerry specific issue, well, shouldn't we blame the programmers, or shouldn't we blame the support personnel? Taking it back to kind of a man-made aspect. That was the common approach until fairly recently. So essentially an attempt has been made to sort of decouple the technology as a risk factor from the human element that is responsible for creating the technology. I know that seems a little goofy because systems don't program themselves, but they do tend to break them out separately when we're assessing risk. So again, we got natural risk factors. We've got man-made actions that are, I guess, think of it as if it's directly caused by an act of a person, that would be man-made. If the risk factor is a direct result of something technology related, and there's no hands-on issue, well, think of it as a system sort of risk. So different our risk factors come from a variety of places. So when we're analyzing risk, we need to be aware of all the different risk factors that we have to deal with. So the risk analysis process, I mean, we've got remember, we've got our threat analysis where we analyze what threats would choose to would benefit from exploiting which vulnerability. So that first bullet, what's the basically I've identified my threats and I've identified my vulnerabilities, and I've connected the dots. This threat would likely use, the Chinese government would likely use hacker tools to gain access to the State Department email system. Just using that as an example. And that's where the analysis comes in. So you've identified a specific threat, you've identified a specific vulnerability, and then it's like, all right, how likely is it that that's going to happen? And when it does happen, bullet 2, determine the possibility of damage occurring. If this particular risk scenario were to take place, would there be any damage associated with that? And the answer to the example I'm using would be, yeah, that would be a fairly high level of damage, I would suspect. And again, how damaging would this be? I mean, both those bullets are kind of the same thing. Determine the possibility of damage occurring. What's the likelihood that that's going to actually happen? And if it does happen, what's the hit? What hit am I taking? Let's take a look at the risk analysis. A planned outage. You bring up a good point. That is more management induced than an unplanned outage. I mean, you can plan to bring a system down for maintenance and let folks know ahead of time that they need to make alternate arrangements for a few hours. But let's take a look at this. So the phases of risk analysis. First of all, the first step, and in a formal process, a lot of businesses, well, generally smaller businesses, haven't really formally actually accomplished this. But what you really need to do is you need to sit down and identify all of your resources, and prioritize which is my most critical resource. Which one, if it took a hit, would have the most impact on my business. That goes to the top of your list. Okay, what's my next most critical resource, and so on and so on and so on. Then, see, the thing is, then you get down to, at some point, you've got, okay, here's a resource that, it's not really that critical. Like maybe you've got in the facility, you've got a daycare center, so to take care of the employees' kids, and out in the backyard of the daycare center is a playground, some playground equipment. If a flood wiped out your playground equipment, that would be, the kids would be sad, and you'd have to find alternate activities for them to do. But that's not really going to have a measurable impact on your business. So even though it belongs to you and you're paying money for these things that you're doing, at some point things are no longer critical from a business perspective. So, but the point is, you identify and prioritize all of your assets. Notice it says determine the value of the asset, and that can be a little soft and squishy. I mean, you may have a receipt from the store where you purchased the asset, but what if your asset is data? It's hard to put a hard dollar value on intellectual property, but I think you would all agree that your intellectual property has monetary value. So this is a pretty important phase in this whole risk analysis process, is formally identifying and prioritizing your assets and assigning a value to those assets. Because once you've got a value assigned, then as you'll see, then you've got some numbers to plug into the math so that you can perform your analyses. Okay, so identify your assets. Yeah, if you're illegally downloading music using peer-to-peer music downloading or downloading software, or videos or something. I guess there's some cases now where the Motion Picture Association of America and other entities have actually finally kind of sort of put a dollar value on a you download a movie from some download site, and the owner of that movie wants to take you to court over it. They now have a fair market value has been determined to be X, and you are liable now for this amount of money. And that's we're going to see some cases where some folks could take some pretty serious financial hits as a sort of warning to everybody else to stop doing it. Going to be some sacrificial lambs out there, but that's pretty much exactly what I'm talking about. I mean, now that you've got a dollar value associated with your assets, you can then proceed. Step 2, vulnerability identification. Step 2 and Step 3 kind of can be handled simultaneously. I mean, you can identify, here's my systems, here's my assets that I've identified in Step 1. Okay, what attack vectors exist? What are my vulnerabilities? I've got a server here that contains sensitive data. Well, let's look at this server is not properly hardened. It's got a bunch of ports open that don't need to be open. That provides an attack vector to that system. So identify the any attack vectors, any ways to exploit that system, and then of course the threat assessment is okay. Let's assume this particular system has a vulnerability that I've identified. Who is likely to exploit that vulnerability? Who wants that information? Who would use that tactic to get at that information? So that's your threat assessment. So you identify your assets, you prioritize them, assign a value to those assets, determine what the vulnerabilities are. If it's a computer system, then you look at the usual suspects, your computer-related things, and so on. But if it's inventory or goods and services, you've got a different threat vector. So you look at the threats. Okay, here's my assets and their vulnerabilities. Who do I need to look at that would exploit this vulnerability? So you'll come up with a list of threats. And we're the government, man. We're nothing if not good at developing lists of threats. Because we're paranoid, and we should be, because people really are trying to get at our stuff. Okay, once you've conducted your vulnerability assessments and your threat assessments, now comes the probability calculations. Okay, it's like, all right, is there a threat? Is there a threat that a meteor might strike my building, leaving a large hole in the ground where my building used to be? Think of that. Think about that for a second. Is that a possibility? Could that actually happen? You should all be going, well, yeah, it could. I mean, what? How often does that happen? It seems pretty unlikely. That's right. It could happen, but the probability of that happening is very low. So in other words, if a meteor strikes your building, that's going to cost you millions and millions of dollars in lost revenues and time and so on. So it'll be very, very costly if that were to happen. However, how many buildings that you are aware of have meteor shields on top of them? I'll give you a moment to think about that. How many facilities are protected with meteor shielding? And you should be thinking, I've never seen a building protected with meteor shielding. That's right. Even though the risk is there. I mean, the vulnerability is there. Your building is it's made out of bricks and mortar and concrete, wood. A meteor would make short work, of your building. So why don't we put meteor shields on the buildings? Because it's too expensive for the likelihood of that actually happening. You'll never get that one past your accounting department. So the deal is, there is the very real possibility that a meteor might strike your building, leaving a large hole in the ground where your building used to be. But most businesses have concluded that that threat is so unlikely that I'm not going to allocate funds towards meteor shielding, where I could allocate those. Remember, you only have X amount of dollars. You have limited funding, so you have to rub your money on the places that will do the most good. So most businesses have chosen not to rub their money on meteor shielding. Okay. But how likely is it your email system is going to be, hacked by the Russian government? Well, that's more likely, and that's something I should probably look at in terms of real life impact. I'm gonna put some money into that to make that system more secure and less vulnerable to that particular threat. So, for each of your threat vulnerability pairs, you conduct that probability quantification. What's the likelihood? That's what risk analysis is. The likelihood of a particular threat exploiting a particular vulnerability. So the likelihood, how likely is it to happen, followed by the impact analysis. Okay, if it does happen, how much of a financial hit am I going to take? So the concept is, if the probability of, and we're going to see this in more detail in a few minutes, but let's say your electrical power grid is not 100%. You're out in the out in some rural area, and every once in a while, doggone it, the power fails. The electric company fails to provide the adequate power for whatever reason. And you've determined, well, if my facility goes without power for 24 hours, I'm gonna lose $100,000 a day. It's gonna cost the impact of 24 hours of power outage would be $100,000. In lost productivity and whatever else. Well then, okay, so gosh, what can I do about that? I mean, we've analyzed that it's pretty likely, that happens not frequently necessarily, but it's pretty likely, and it's a pretty big hit. So then we get to our countermeasures, like, well, in that case, cost-effective measures to reduce risk. The thing is, here's the overriding principle: you don't spend $10 to protect $5. Don't spend $10 to protect $5. So in this case, if the loss of electrical power is going to cost me $100,000 in lost productivity, what can I do to mitigate that risk? Well, for the low price of $5,000 US, I'm going to buy a diesel powered generator, and some diesel fuel. And I have some money left over. I'm going to buy a few uninterruptible power supplies to keep my critical systems online when the power goes out, kind of thing. So now, I've provided, I've put a little bit of money into mitigation strategies. So now when the power goes out, I suffer a $0 hit. $0. Why? Because my power's not going out. I've got local assets that are going to continually provide electrical power until the grid comes back online. So that's an example of a cost-effective measure to reduce risk. Hey, I can buy a generator or two and some UPS devices. Man, I'm pretty much covered for electrical failure. Whereas the countermeasures determination for that kind of meteor thing, it's like, well, we could spend $100 billion on some state-of-the-art meteor shield made out of the same stuff that Captain America uses. That stuff is very expensive and hard to find. So that's not cost-effective. You're spending billions of dollars to mitigate a threat that's ridiculously unlikely to happen. So this is actually a pretty good list here. Step one, before you do anything else, you have to determine, okay, what do I actually have around here that is of value? What's the most important thing I've got? And is there a dollar figure I can attach to that? What's the most important thing? What's the next most important thing? What's the third most important thing? And so on and so on and so on. Okay, now that I've identified my assets, I identify vulnerabilities associated with those assets. Well, this data resides on a Microsoft Windows Server 2008 machine. The vendor of that machine is IBM. It's a model number thus and such, and so on. So you've got some quantifiable things now that you can conduct a vulnerability analysis on. All right, this system, foreign governments would benefit from compromising the email system that our State Department diplomats use to conduct official business. That's a very real possibility. And then we do our probability quantification. How likely does this happen? Pretty damn likely. What's the impact? Pretty damn high. Well, then we need to take care of that little problem right away. And let's take a look at some countermeasures and how can we harden our system, and what can we do to let's look at firewall technologies and port filtering a variety of other techniques. So the risk analysis process starts with asset identification and winds up with what's the likelihood of this particular threat exercising this particular vulnerability to get at my asset. Risk analysis methods. This from a testing perspective is very simple. You've basically got quantitative methods and qualitative methods, and then somewhere in between, the semi-quantitative. It's easy to remember. Quantitative, if you've got hard numbers, if you've got actual receipts, dollar values, you've got hard numbers that are pretty indisputable there. Your risk assessment is going to be based on these quantitative values, these hard number values. For other things, maybe intellectual property sort of stuff, you're relying on experience, you're relying on judgment. You don't necessarily have any hard numbers per se, but it's all based on your expert judgment as an expert in the field as to the value of said asset. So qualitative methods are based on judgment, based on gut feeling. We hire you. You get paid the big bucks because you're kind of a well-known, recognized industry expert, and your judgment carries a higher weight than some civilian might. So that's why you're on the payroll, to kind of make these quality judgments. So qualitative is based on experience and intuition, best practices, those kind of things, human factors. Quantitative analysis is based on hard numbers. So semi-quantitative is, I've got some hard numbers, but that doesn't tell the whole story. I've got to kind of use my judgment to determine just how important this asset is. Maybe you paid a certain dollar figure for a particular machine, but that machine, it has now become an industry standard, and it's worth it's worth a lot more money now than it was when you bought it, because you were smart, you bought it on sale or something. So it's like, well, here's the receipt, but does that tell the whole story? I'm seeing these things on eBay for 5 times more money, so I'm gonna modify my risk analysis to make this asset, a little more, more correct in terms of valuation. So again, I'm belaboring this point. It's super easy. Quantitative, numbers; qualitative, judgment; semi-quantitative, somewhere in the middle. Both factors factor in. So here's and every organization will do this, and there's plenty of third-party guidance to assist you in actually doing some of these calculations. So let's kind of talk about it in broad terms first. Now, this is obviously a grossly oversimplified, risk calculation sort of, spreadsheet kind of deal. And so, we're looking at a subset. We're looking at, okay, flood damage, electrical failure, flu epidemic. Everybody that's got kids knows that, first week of school, the kids all, interact with all the other dirty, disgusting kids and bring home all sorts of dirty, disgusting diseases, and mommy and daddy get sick the week after school starts, kind of thing. So that's just the way stuff works. So you've identified that risk of occurrence, as you can see, based on, again, there's no, you can use a low, medium, high, a numbered, scale, numbered 1 to 9 or 1 to 5 or whatever. Again, just, pick something. There's plenty of industry guidance on that. There's plenty of different models that can be selected from. The point is, pick one. It's not a big deal. In our example, we're using either quantitative, qualitative, or semi-quantitative methods to peg that risk of occurrence at our value of 1, 2, 3, 4, or 5. Low to high. Okay, the impact. That's why we pay you the big bucks to tell us, hey, if this this flu epidemic causes my production staff to not be able to come to work today, how much is it going to cost me? Well, that's going to cost you, based on my calculations, that's going to be about $200,000 in lost productivity. Oh man, look at the mitigation over there. Well, we could offer free flu shots to everybody during taken just during the appropriate times of the year when that flu bug goes around, kind of a deal. So we can potentially, for fairly low cost, maybe mitigate that risk factor fairly successfully. That electrical fail thing, we talked about that pretty much already. Notice that we've assessed the risk of occurrence is pretty low. It's not super low, but it's pretty low. However, it's a pretty big hit if it happens. But I can mitigate that risk factor by spending a few bucks on a generator or some UPS devices. That'll take my $100,000 hit, turn it into a $0 hit. That's good, cost-effective risk mitigation right there, folks. Flood damage. Let's talk about that for a minute. Look at that number. It's high. Why? Because you're an idiot and you built your facility right in the middle of a floodplain because some real estate agent sold you a bill of goods. Anyway, it is what it is. You're in a location, or you're on the coast. You're in California, and you're anywhere on the California coast. At any minute, California is going to break off and slip into the ocean, right? I mean, we know this. Florida, within 200 years, Florida will be gone. Florida will be underwater, the whole freaking state, within 200 years. So if your building is in Tampa or Miami, the risk of flood damage is pretty high, kind of a deal. So the deal is, okay, let's assume, okay, the river overflows and sends a foot of water, rushing across my parking lot, and I get some water damage in my basement. I've conducted some research. From a historical perspective, who's really good at giving you historical information like this? Insurance companies. You can check with insurance companies to determine how frequently does this property flood. Well, according to insurance company records that go back 200 years, about every 5 years, give or take. It's like, oh man, okay, so pretty likely it's going to happen. If it does happen, we're going to take a pretty significant financial hit. Now, the mitigation step there is, you know what? I'm willing to take out flood insurance. I'm going to transfer that risk from me to the insurance company. The flood is still going to happen. My parking lot's still going to be, washed out, and I'm still going to have water damage in my basement. I mean, there's only so much you can do with sandbags and other technologies. But you know what? If I've factored the cost of my insurance premiums into the mix, and when it happens, boom, I give the insurance company a call. They give me a check. Problem solved, right? So again, there's different types of threats, different types of mitigation techniques. If I were to put vulnerability, meteor strike down there, identify source. Well, that'd be against the physical plant. Risk of occurrence. If there was a number lower than 1, you'd want to put that in there. Dollar impact. I don't know, what's your business worth? This business looks like it's probably worth $40 million. Mitigation. Meteor shielding, or there's no relocating to a facility inside a mountain, maybe, but that seems expensive to me. So there, you're just going to have to accept that risk. You know what? That, even though it would be a huge hit, it's not very likely to happen. Executive decision. We're going to accept that risk. We're just going to put it out there and say, you know what? We're just going to go commando on this one. We're going to provide no protection at all for meteor strike. That's why they hired me. I'm a rebel. I'm a maverick. I have these business insights that are going to lead us to high profits. So these risk calculations. Now let's talk about some terminology. Go to your book there. Some terms you're going to be needing to be familiar with. There's what's called a single loss expectancy, an SLE. So, like, look at this chart on the wall here. If my facility floods, the SLE for that is $95,000. The single loss expectancy, the amount of damage or loss from each incident, each instance of that risk factor. So that's the SLE. Okay. So single loss expectancy. If it happens, how much does it cost me? A related term is what's called ALE, annualized or annual loss expectancy. Okay. So factor this out over a year, or annually. So let's say just for the sake of argument that records back up that the facility floods on average every 10 years. So once every 10 years, you're going to suffer a $95,000 hit. So the annualized loss expectancy, you factor that in, you amortize that over 10 years. So basically, you have to provide for, or you have to create procedures to handle a $9,500 loss annually. That overall, so in other words, it's $95,000 to happen once, but if it only happens once every 10 years, then you kind of take that number, divide it by 10. So that's how much of a hit that you spread across the entire time frame. So in this case, my ALE, my annual loss expectancy, is the annual value of that. On the other hand, let's say my electrical grid, let's say it goes offline 4 times a year. So that means every time it happens, I get hit for $100,000. So the annualized loss expectancy is that times the occurrence. So I would take $100,000 times 4. Boom, there's my ALE. In the other case, in the previous case, it would be 95,000 times 0.1, right? 10%, 0.1. That's going to give me my 9,500. So you have to look at. I'm performing my accounting based on annualizing the damage. So if I take that hit more than once in a year, I got to factor that in. If I only take that hit once every 10 years, I got to factor that in. So that becomes, when you take your ALE, basically for each risk, what's it during that period of time, turn that into my multiply that by the single loss expectancy. That becomes my annual rate of occurrence, my ARO. Okay, determine total cost of the organization. So my electrical failure, my SLE is 100,000. My annual loss expectancy is 400,000. And so, how about this? My annual rate of occurrence, that's 4. How often does this happen in a year? It happens 4 times a year. So I take my SLE times my ARO, annualized rate of recurrence, that gives me my ALE, my annualized loss expectancy. So as much as I hate to say it, you're probably going to have to be at least passingly familiar with the math associated with that. So again, you take your single loss expectancy, the number for a single hit, multiply that by your annualized rate of recurrence. If it happens twice a year, your ARO is 2. If it happens once every 5 years, your ARO is 0.2, 20% a year. So again, on the test, you're not going to have to do any form of real complex math, but you're going to have to figure out things, to that degree of complexity. So your SLE times your ARO, that's going to give you your ALE, your annual loss expectancy. Okay. A little bit more on that when we get into some additional calculations in another chapter. But again, and that's the planning. You've got X amount of dollars. You have some pot of money in your budget that to apply to these situations. It's like I'm going to take out some flood insurance to handle that flood deal. Just kind of so I can spread that cost of handling that out over that period. Electrical failure, for a fairly small investment, we can take that $100,000 hit, turn it into a $0 hit. We can do that. The flu shots thing, if we've conducted some studies that show, prior to giving everybody flu shots, it's a $200,000 hit. After flu shots, the hit is much, much lower because there's much less, in terms of loss of productivity that way. So again, you'd have to go, there might be, 200 things on this list, and you'd have to go do that calculation for all 200 of those things. That's what I was talking about earlier. You look at each threat, each vulnerability. Notice, if you will, 2 of these are vulnerabilities against the physical plant. Flood damage and electrical failure, those are 2 things that affect the physical plant. There may be 50 things that affect the physical plant. So again, you have to look at each threat vulnerability combination independently, and you have to do that as many times as you have risk factors. Okay, this is a very very simplified example. Okay, been there, done that. There's in your book, not in your book, I'm sorry, on the website, in the Learn To section, there's those calculations are broken out, and there's some examples there. So definitely go look at those. So how do you handle risk? We've already talked about most of them, but let's talk about it anyway. Risk avoidance. If I don't want this to happen. Can I avoid this risk? Well, first of all, let me ask you this, and be formulate a response in your head, because I know what the answer is already. If somebody were to ask you, can you eliminate risk? Can you eliminate risk? Now you're being clever. You're thinking, I know what he's looking for. He's looking for the answer to be, no, you can't eliminate risk. Because we've got all these techniques to manage risk. The answer is yes, you can. You can eliminate risk. What? But to eliminate the risk, you have to eliminate the activity that is the source of the risk. You might be running a resort hotel, and you want to include bungee jumping off of a bridge as part of your package for your customers, but the numbers show you that this risk is totally unacceptable. The insurance is way overpriced. You can't afford the insurance. And people are dying every day from bungee jumping accidents. And you determine, we just can't take the risk here. I'm not willing to accept that risk, so I'm going to avoid that activity. If you can avoid that financial liability by simply not providing that activity, well, some of your customers may be disappointed, but at least they're alive. And unless you lose significant enough business, then that was probably a smart choice. I am a Navy helicopter pilot, U.S. Navy helicopter pilot. I do exceedingly dumb things. I land a helicopter on the deck of a small warship at night in bad weather conditions. It's very, very dangerous. Dangerous to the point of being just almost criminally stupid. Case in point, back in the early 90s, before the first Gulf War, I was out in the Persian Gulf, the Arabian Gulf. The French were out there, the Brits were out there, the Russians were out there. Everybody was out there. Everybody, there's a large enough space. Everybody's kind of patrolling around doing whatever they do. But when the sun set, everybody else, they would go home. All their little aircraft would land and they'd be put away for the night, and they'd go down in the wardroom and drink wine and eat escargot and French bread and smoke cigars. While me, I'm out there like an idiot in the middle of the friggin' night, dark as hell, flying around, converting jet fuel into noise. That was my primary job. And it's like, hey, U.S. government, this is exceedingly dangerous. These operating conditions, claim the lives of naval pilots every year, loss of millions of dollars worth of hardware and so on. But somebody above my pay grade said, shut up. You're going to do it. Get out there and stop whining about it. Because they want us to be able to operate in those conditions. Should conditions deteriorate to where, hey, I want to know I can rely on Mark to take that helicopter out in the middle of the night to go rescue some merchant seaman who had a heart attack on some fishing vessel 200 miles out to sea, kind of a thing. I want to be able to rely on him to be able to do that. So I'm willing to accept that risk. So the point is, that was an overly dramatic point I just made, but the point is, you as the chairman of the board, you as the CEO, at some point, the buck stops with you guys, and at some point, you have to make the call. You have to determine, is this an acceptable risk? Yes or no, based on your business requirements. If it is, then it is. If it's not, then stop doing that, kind of a thing. So at some point, also, let me just throw this in there real quick. At the end of it all, at the end of, you've applied risk mitigation strategies, you've, accepted risk. When it's all said and done, the amount of risk that's remaining after you've done everything to mitigate it and whatever else, the amount of risk remaining is called residual risk. There's very few activities that don't come with some level of residual risk, and that's ultimately what you have to accept. After everything is said and done, there's still this percentage of risk associated with that business function. Am I willing or not willing to accept that risk? If you are, boom. If you're not, you're not. And that happens all the time. You might have some information system with sensitive data, and it's a real hot potato, and it's got there's everybody in the world would like to get their hands on it and stuff, and you haven't demonstrated that it's properly secured yet, and you haven't worked out all the bugs. The authorizing official, the AO, is going to say, yeah, no, I am not willing to sign on the dotted line accepting that level of risk. I don't accept it. I'm going to refuse permission to authorize, or I'm going to refuse permission to operate, and you have to go back and fix your problems before you come back to me, kind of thing. So ultimately, somebody has to accept the responsibility, the CEO, the board of directors, and you either will or you won't. It's pretty much that simple. So we can avoid risk only if you really avoid the activity associated with that risk. And if you can, based on your business model, business requirements, then great. If you can't, great. That's just the way it is. Transference of risk. You know what? My parking lot's going to flood once a year because of this. This river's going to overflow its banks during rainy season. It happens like clockwork every year. There's nothing I can do about it. or every 10 years, let's say, whatever, it doesn't matter. Nothing I can do about it. So I'm willing to accept that. I'm willing to, I accept I can't do anything about it. So I'm going to transfer that risk to a third party, like an insurance company. So when the flood happens, I make a phone call, they give me a check, life goes on. I mean, you still have to clean up, but that check is gonna pay for the cleanup crew and the disposal and all that stuff, right? We talked about acceptance. At the end of the day, you either accept the risk. When I say you, I mean whoever is responsible, like the CEO. You either accept the risk or you don't. The term mitigation, what can I do to lessen the impact of this risk factor? We used the electrical power failure example earlier. Hey, I can buy a generator. I can buy some diesel fuel, so that if my power goes off, boom, I fire up the generator, I'm good to go. Some UPS devices keep my critical systems from going offline when the power fails. So mitigation, again, the thing about mitigation it has to be cost effective. You can't spend $10 to protect 5. You can spend $4 to protect 5. You can spend $3 to protect 5, but you don't spend $6 to protect 5. So again, your mitigation strategies have to be cost effective. Deterrent, the concept here, applying changes to the conditions make it less likely or enticing for an attacker to attack in the first place. Again, we talked about physical security type controls. If it's one way to lessen my risk is deter the attacker from the attempt in the first place. Nothing like a barbed wire fence with machine gun manned watchtowers there to kind of keep the physical intrusions down to a minimum. That kind of thing. My who knows, my guards that are walking up and down walking the beat with their guns might not even be loaded. That video camera that's installed in your convenience store might not even be. It may be a dummy camera. But the fact that you've got a camera pointing right at where the bad guys would be perpetrating bad things, that may deter them from doing bad things, thinking they're on surveillance video and that they'll be caught. So there's ways to respond to risk. So it's on the test. It's really logical, really easy. You shouldn't be confused. Now, just make sure you understand the definitions. You recognize the definitions, but it's all common sense, really. So you should actually, in most situations, I tell you guys, really don't rely on common sense. That'll just get you into trouble. But in this situation, you can kind of say, well, what would the reasonable man do here? That's probably the right answer, and it probably is the right answer. So apply a little common sense to your risk response strategies. Now, talked about this earlier. Remember our risk mitigation strategies, the different control types. The quick definition here. Technical controls are hardware and software. Programs, firewalls, hardware, software, easy. Management controls, sometimes you'll see those referred to as administrative controls. Management controls are your policy-based controls. Your choice to audit certain activities, your choice to have your users sign an acceptable use policy document. So the concept being that the user is less likely to engage in this risky behavior because of the threat of getting fired or going to jail, that kind of thing. So that's a management control. Operational controls are your, let's say, day-to-day things like door locks, just normal everyday, fire prevention techniques. Having a guard with a dog patrolling the perimeter. Those are operational controls. Then this new category has been added, these loss/damage controls, implemented to protect key assets from being damaged, reducing the chances of loss occurring, reducing the severity of a loss. For example, fire extinguishers, sprinkler systems, those are while technically those are operational controls, those type of controls that are explicitly designed to literally minimize loss. Those are loss/damage controls. So now you're thinking, well, that's tricky. How can I really tell the difference? Well, they gave some pretty good examples there. I mean, a fire suppression system is a good example of what would be referred to as a damage control. If the goal is for this control to react in some way to minimize damage, that would be, and that could, that may take one of the other three forms. So a loss control, like a fire extinguishing system, would be an example of an operational control, but an intrusion prevention system would be an example of a technical control. So this intrusion prevention, an IPS, an intrusion prevention system, would be a risk mitigation strategy to minimize a particular attack vector. That would be an example of a technical control. And then both of those, there might be written policy guidance behind both of those things. So there's an element of management control in there also. So again, certain controls, I mean, your like normal auditing, that's a technical control, but that might be more of along the lines of a detective type control. Whereas auditing is not directly going to prevent loss. So auditing would not be an example of a damage control. A sprinkler system is an example of a damage control. An IPS is an example of a damage control. But maintaining logs would be, that would be a technical control, but not a damage control. So you have to like ask yourself, is this control actually going to limit the my system's damage? In which case that would satisfy the criteria to be a damage control or a loss control. Let's look at vulnerability assessment techniques. Now there is an activity associated with that first part of the chapter there, activity 8-1. So that's one to look over. Let's take a look at topic B though. Implement vulnerability assessment tools and techniques. Okay. First off, we've already talked about baselines, the concept of baselines. Absolutely. Fire prevention. Like a fire prevention technique by maybe the use of non-flammable materials. That would be a fire prevention technique. But would using non-flammable materials be considered a damage control? Probably, because those non-flammable materials you're using directly impact that particular vulnerability, that reduce the dollar value of loss. So I would say that fire prevention, fire suppression techniques would be considered damage controls. Little soft and squishy gray area there, but I'd say yeah. So let's take a look at. All right, I'm on board. I get the process. Threat assessment, vulnerability assessment. Let's talk vulnerability assessment. And we're not completely concerned only with information systems and computers and data, but that is the emphasis here. So I've got my computer systems, that hold my data. When we first install these things, we create baseline reports. We take these baseline readings of how my system responds, how my system is performing periodically. So review these baseline reports. Look for trend information. So if the initial baseline, I'm just going to use some kind of semi-bogus example here. Let's say on my initial baseline for the installation of my system, it showed average processor use hovering around 50%. 3 months later, I can see my average processor use has kind of moved up to like 60%. 3 months after that, my average processor use has creeped up to 70%. So being the smart guy that I am, I'm going to look at that and go, based on this, I'll be at 90% within 6 months, and that's critical. So I'm going to use that information to essentially develop a new system or add some capacity or do something so that I don't have a vulnerability. Like for example, if my system gets to 90% utilization, then it's been known to crash unexpectedly. I want to keep it from getting to the point where these vulnerabilities will exist. So by reviewing your baselines, you can observe trends and also potentially catch unusual activity that may indicate there's an attack underway or that there's already a vulnerability that's being exploited. Okay, so that's something you can certainly do because you capture that data anyway. You've got that information, that historical information laying around anyway. Perform regular code reviews. Okay, who does that? People in the development environment. That's once the product is deployed. Yeah, the code reviews really aren't going to help you that much. The regular code reviews are beneficial during the development process. And as we talked about before, the development process is a big deal because we want to kind of use proper, secure development techniques to kind of keep vulnerabilities out of the finished product as much as we can. We're not always successful. There's always vulnerabilities that we find and patch. Okay. The reason we hired you, the reason we're paying you the big bucks, is to determine the attack surface. The attack surface, I like that term. It's a fancy term. It sounds military. But basically, you need to look at your asset, and pretty much every place, every potential entry point into your system is part of the attack surface. Now, if I use normal hardening techniques, and let's say I do a port scan on my system, and I discover there's half a dozen ports open that shouldn't be, by closing those ports, I have reduced the attack surface. I've eliminated one entry point into my system, and the bad guys will have to try some other entry point, which I'm guarding more carefully, which there's more eyeballs on it. So figure out, how can the bad guys get in? What is my attack surface? I mean, at some point, you've kind of eliminated all the easy stuff, and now you're left with, okay, I got to have, this is a web server, I got to have port 80 and port 443 open. I can't not do that, otherwise it wouldn't be any good to me. So that's going to be where the bad guys are going to be coming in. So I know that. So so I've determined the attack surface, I've factored that into determining my attack surface. So I can't turn that off. So that's where they're going to be coming in. Review the security architecture. Evaluation of the organization's current infrastructure model and measures, basically the systems in place, the network infrastructure, and the topologies, and the protocols in use. Which routing protocols am I using? Which type model series of router and switch have I got deployed? What are my what kind of servers do I have redundancy built into my servers and so on. And then that goes into the design. The security design is you take the security architecture into account, and then based on the security architecture, you're going to actually design the specific security plan that you're going to then implement. So you want to verify that the design is sound, that it's you didn't leave out any critical evaluation steps. You're checking everything you need to check, those kind of things. So these are just we don't have tools and software programs associated at this stage yet. I mean, each of those steps might have some specific applications that you use, but again, the understanding the baseline. The baseline is very important in that shows what's normal for that system, what I expect to see, and variations in that, over time, because things happen, things change. I mean, when you performed your initial baseline, maybe you were supporting, 100 users. Well, 6 months later, you might be supporting 500 users. Your system became very popular. So that baseline may represent, that new baseline reading you take may show the effect of adding those additional users, and give you some information you need to expand your system, scale it up potentially. So vulnerability assessment techniques. Now let's look at some of the tools, and I will say on this test they're not going to go into a lot of specifics on third-party utilities, but you might see a couple. So don't just blow those off. Just kind of be aware of of what like what Jack the Ripper is. Jack the Ripper is a password cracking tool. What Wireshark is. Wireshark is a protocol analyzer. So these first two on the list, protocol analyzer and sniffer, packet analyzer, they're essentially the same thing. Generally, and this is not federal law or anything, generally a protocol analyzer is implemented as a piece of software, a program like Wireshark, or if you're a Microsoft guy, there are products called Network Monitor, and there are others. But a sniffer, again, generally a sniffer is hardware based. There's a device that you purchase that obviously has software on it that does this, but there's a device called a sniffer. Like there's a company called Data General that manufactures this device called the sniffer that you plug into your network and then capture packets off of it. So again, the net effect is the same. Protocol analyzers and sniffers capture packets for further analysis. I'm going to leave vulnerability scanner out for a minute. A port scanner. One of the hardening techniques we talked about before is scan your system using appropriate tools. Like for example, there's a command line utility called netstat, and you use netstat-A, I think, to well, of course, netstat reveals your UDP and TCP ports that are open on a given machine. Clay mentions a tool we mentioned in class before called Nmap, N-M-A-P. And you go to nmap.org. You can also go, there's a website you guys should probably go to at some point called insecure.org. I-N-S-E-C-U-R-E, insecure.org. This website kind of shows you the top tools that people are using and gives you download links to a bunch of different vulnerability scanners and hacker tools and stuff. It's really a pretty interesting place. It's not hinky or scary or virus infected. It's nothing like that. But it's a pretty good website for security professionals to be aware of. Insecure.org. Kind of make a note of it. Later on, just go there and look at it, check it out. I've been there on OpenNet before, looking around. Nothing bad happened to me. So, but again, it's if you're following trends and seeing what the tools are that most people are using for various things, it's kind of it'll keep you up to date. Plus, it's like, man, everybody's using this tool. I want to get this tool. Oh, this tool costs $12,000. Well, I don't really want it that much anymore. I want this free tool instead. Okay, but a port scanner scans ports. Ports are, open ports are an indication of what functions that machine is performing, whether or not you think it's performing that function. Like the example I gave you previously, installing Server 2000 also installed the web server right along with the process. Even if your machine wasn't going to be a web server, it's a web server, and basically the bad guys can exploit any exploits that web server product exposes. And you're going, well, I'm not using it as a web server. Well, why should I care? Well, because the bad guy is using your unlocked back door to crawl around in your house. Just because you only use the front door doesn't mean somebody else isn't using the back door. So you should all lock your back door too, kind of a thing. what's a honey pot in certain locations? Oh, Nmap install. Yeah, absolutely. No. The lab, there's an Nmap lab where you actually get to play with Nmap, and I'm pretty sure there's a Wireshark lab in there too. So there's some pretty fun labs in this section. So again, don't do this on your production network. That would be bad. Okay, so a honeypot is and if there's one word to describe it, it's a decoy. It's a decoy system. It's designed to lure the bad guys to this phony system that looks like a real system. It might, you've got it's secured kind of the same way a regular production system would be, because you don't want to make it too easy. The bad guys are a little more sophisticated than that. They'll recognize that you're trying to fool them. But if you treat this honeypot like it's like a legitimate deal, you might even have data on there. It doesn't have to be real data. Maybe there's like a two-part deal here. One, the honeypot, if that attracts the users thinking it's the real deal, that gives you some solid intelligence. Now you have some addresses of malicious users. You can potentially observe their techniques and figure out what they're attempting to do. Maybe even figure out the signature associated with various tools they're using. Eventually, one of two things is going to happen. They're going to figure out that they've been snookered, and they're going to just leave. Hopefully, you've captured some information from them before they do, or they may be better than you thought. They may actually be able to exploit your honeypot and assume administrative control of it, which means you just reach over and pull the plug, and that solves that problem. But again, the big concept there, the honeypot, and it can be a real physical machine. It can be a virtual machine, because again, on the network, nobody knows a virtual machine from a real machine. It's just as real as a real machine. And speaking of that, there's another word you might see called honeynet, where you'd have an entire sort of bogus subnet with a variety of different services available on it that might be something that the bad guys attack thinking it's the real deal. Same deal. It's a decoy system, designed to allow you to gather information and also draw them away from your real system, which may be just a couple of subnets over, and they haven't found that one yet because they're concentrating on this fake system. So honeypot. Now, vulnerability scanner. Essentially, all these things, like for example, I like to tell people all port scanners are vulnerability scanners, but not all vulnerability scanners are port scanners. All these things, protocol analyzer, port scanners, they're all kind of those are subsets of the overall vulnerability scanner umbrella. The term vulnerability scanner is broad on purpose. I mean, there's a variety of different kinds of vulnerability, and there's actually some references in here to that, but actually really not so much. They used to actually have a list of some of the third-party tools, like Metasploit and Nessus and Microsoft Baseline Security Analyzer and Wireshark and DSniff and AirCrack, a whole bunch of these things. I'm sure they're listed somewhere. I'm actually surprised they're not front and center in the text, which tells me that the test really doesn't test you on your knowledge of specific tools. And the good thing about that is that stuff changes. So if you learn a whole lot of stuff about Nmap, and then next week Nmap nobody's using it anymore because some better tools come along, they haven't really accomplished their goal in terms of what the Security Plus is trying to do, is just give you knowledge and understanding about all these various security techniques and concepts and so on. So it does look like maybe they've de-emphasized that a little